So, when PS5 came out, one really cool feature that people really liked was finally being able to see your total playtime for your games, because we knew that Sony was always tracking this during the PS4 era, and now they finally show you your entire history and how long you've played your games for on PS4, PS5 by going to your profile on a PS5 console. But the problem is, two something years later, and I still see this, often, which is people complaining the timer is not accurate. These times seem way off, or I have a save file that says something different. What's going on? Why can't Sony get this right? Let's explain why. Now, before diving into my numbers and testing, my general assumption with this has always been you launch a game on PS4, PS5, the timer starts, and it does not stop until you close that game. That's likely the easiest way for Sony to gather all that telemetry without making this sort of discretion on is it paused, suspended, are there button inputs? They're not doing anything highly specific, and that's why discrepancies come in, because a lot of folks may see a game with an in-game tracker attached to the save file, and that's developer specific. So at that point, we're looking at how the developer has chosen to track their playtime. And oftentimes that's where it's going to get a lot more accurate. But I did go through most of my game library and tried to find titles that had an in-game tracker, because that's the other little caveat here, is that many games don't offer this at all. So you're really only left with what Sony is telling you, and that's why you might see a time and think, well, that doesn't seem right. So let's talk about some of my games. We'll go from the most accurate to the least accurate. So A Short Hike was a 1 hour difference. PS5 says 4 hours. My save file, which really this is something where you can't see the save file, but it has a speedrun mode. So the clock stopped at 5 hours and 3 minutes because this is a cleared save file. And this is also one of the very few games where technically the save file says it's longer than PS5, but I would imagine it's fairly close. Octodad is a 2 hour difference. PS5 says 6 hours. The save file says 4 hours and 25 minutes. Bug Snacks, PS5 says 25 hours. My save file says, it's 19 hours total and 47 minutes across two different save files. Elder Scrolls Skyrim, PS5 says 100 hours, but my save file says 94 hours and 55 minutes. Death Stranding is a 6 hour difference for a 100 hour save file. Again, so 106 on PS5, save file is 100. The Last of Us Part 2, 40 hours reported on PS5, but my save file says 30 hours, and I have a New Game Plus at 1 hour and 22 minutes. Persona 5 is 146 hours on the console, but the save file says 134 hours and 58 minutes. Horizon Forbidden West is a 14-hour difference. PS5 says 85, the save file says 71 and 45 minutes. God of War Ragnarok is a 23-hour difference. PS5 says 78 hours, the save file says 55 hours and 20 minutes. Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, the PS2 emulation version, was a 32-hour difference. PS5 says 53 hours, but the save file says 21 hours and 4 minutes. Bloodborne is a massive 67-hour difference where PS5 says 117, but my save file across two of them is 57 hours total. Now, you go through the whole list and, you kind of think, okay, how did that happen? How did this happen? Bloodborne, I think it's because, and this was a while ago, so I assume this is what happened, but, it was my first Souls game that I really sat down and tried to get through, so I know I had one file that I spent a lot of time in that first area trying to get to Cleric Beast. It didn't seem like 50-something hours, but, I spent a good portion of time there, and then I think I got rid of that file, so that might explain why there's some bloat contributing to that particular title, but it did not feel like 50 hours. Maybe I'm really that bad, but that was years ago, right? So it's hard to remember. Something else that caught my eye was Last Stop on PS5, because I played this somewhat recently for the 30 Platinums Part 2 video, and that game takes like 8+ hours, but for some reason my time was reset on that game. It looks like I just, booted it up once and then closed it right away, which I think I have done, but it's pretty much ignoring my initial playthrough, which may be because it just didn't track it at all, or maybe it got reset somehow, because this could also explain why there's just an issue with some games not showing up at all. You know, you log into your PS5 for the first time, you check your PS4 history, and there's some games in there that just don't show up. That's the case for me. I know that's what happened to a lot of people. And so, you know, the timer does act like trophies in that whether you're offline or online, it's always counting. But when you're online, it should handshake with PSN and register that data. But it seems like it's a little bit screwy and not nearly as reliable as, you know, unlocking trophies, right? But trying to figure out when this thing actually is counting and comparing that to developer options, I mean, this is where it gets complicated, because based on how the developer counts it, there's too many permutations, whether it's, you know, suspending the game, pausing the game, restarting from checkpoints, if they count that, load screens, cutscenes. You know, every developer does this differently. Sometimes the clock just keeps running, and that's where we can get into some outliers, because while most situations people usually see that PS5 has a bloated runtime versus the in-game clock, but there are situations where my in-game save files were longer. Now, why is that the case? So, for example, I had Demon Souls at a 17-hour difference. PS5 says 64 hours, but my save file was 81 hours. And Returnal was a 10-hour difference. PS5, 87 hours. The save file was 97 hours and 37 minutes. These two games always have the timer running, even when you're suspended. So I took it a step further. I started Demon Souls on an account that has not played it ever before, and I let it sit for like 20-30 minutes, and I made sure it was on the suspended status, so the game is running, it's launched, but I just sat on the PS5 home screen, closed it. Took a long time for it to finally update, a few hours, but I did find that PlayStation 5 was only reporting 6 minutes, which seems a bit long, because it doesn't take long to boot the game up and get into the tutorial. But be that as it may, that is an example of we can see the console will only record time, presumably, when you're actively on the screen, and it likely ignores all those other things that we just talked about. So getting into that, one game that I spotted was Bugsnax at a 7-minute time on one of my other accounts, and that's great because you boot up Bugsnax and it's got an in-game tracker, and sure enough it says 7 minutes, so it's right on the dot. You know, it's a fresh save file, so there's not much room for the for it to get screwy just yet. But testing Bugsnax, you learn that the tracking, the in-game tracking, I should say, will work while the game's suspended, but it won't work while it's paused, and it also stops tracking when you just stay in the same area, if you're not moving around, if you're not hitting new checkpoints. Same for God of War Ragnarok. That game is actually pretty strict and fairly accurate in terms of recording genuine playtime, because the in-game clock is not working unless you are basically moving around and hitting new realm doors and things like that, right? So you can see how these games can have lower playtime counts versus what PS5 is telling you. So with that in mind, that's generally what we should know. That, and also classic games for PS1 and PSP, the emulated titles with the PS Plus relaunch, the ones that have the save states and the rewinds. Those, I would assume, seemingly mess up the PlayStation 5 and also PS4 tracker, because a lot of my games are just either less than an hour or 40 minutes. Sometimes there's like nothing on there, basically, when I know I spent more than an hour on all those games. So I think the one thing to take away here, because we're kind of getting long on the tooth, is that there's a lot of ways this can go, right? And that's why there's a lot of inaccuracies. Either the games aren't being tracked, or based on your own play habits of maybe you pause the game, you're checking something out on Twitter, you're reading a guide, you're watching YouTube videos. I do this a lot, and so that's why a lot of my games, I see that they're actually pretty big, but it also depends on how the developer's counting it. If you're seeing the difference and you're wondering why is it so big, the answer is there's just too many situations where this can happen, right? But what we could probably say confidently is that PS5 will record pretty much anything you're doing as long as you are on the screen running the game, not on the PS5 home menu. Control Center, I think, is okay as well, but that's my crude, not very scientific conclusion. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you haven't just yet, please consider subscribing for the best PlayStation news, reviews, and updates that are here on YouTube. You can also follow me on Twitter at MysticRyan, and that is it. I will see you all in my next video. You take it easy.